like to talk about the Arab Uprisings 6 years after. We are really very grateful that both have accepted to come and to launch what I think would be a composed oral discussion about how this has happened and where and how we ended up here today. We sent them a bunch of questions about regional factors, international factors, disengagement, the lack of leadership in mobilization, and they decided that each one will go as he likes. So I don't have the least idea what they will be covering, but like the Arab Uprisings, we will trust them and let them speak. So Sinan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the invitation and for the opportunity. Thank you all for coming. It is an honor to be here. And I have just informal remarks and themes because obviously the subject is too vast. Can you all hear me? I should say the subject is too vast. Despite the commonalities, of course, the trajectories have been quite different in the various countries because of internal and external factors. But of course, it's crucial to assess and critically evaluate and understand these revolutionary waves. But it's always, I think, important, and this should have happened early on, to study and scrutinize the counter-revolutionary forces, because we cannot talk or understand these revolutions or uprisings or whatever we want to call them without understanding the counter-revolution. I was going to start with a very important quote by Raymond Williams, which says, quote, "To be truly radical is to make hope possible rather than despair convincing." And I personally am usually a very pessimistic person, but I think utter pessimism is a luxury that many cannot afford. Why this quote? Of course, because the climate now in the region is one of overwhelming and often debilitating despair. Understandably so, but without ever belittling the loss of human life and underestimating the catastrophes, it is important not to succumb to collective despair and remember, I think, that despair itself is the oxygen of authoritarian and anti-democratic regimes and anti-revolutionary forces as well. And as I said, of course, the way we discuss or approach these events and their repercussions and effects will depend on how we understand them. Are they revolutions? Are they revolts? Or are they uprisings? And we can get to that in the discussion. One important point, I guess, is that many of us who were elated and inspired by the fact that these revolutions or revolts took place were a bit too optimistic and kind of expected immediate change. And what has happened is that the way revolutions develop and unfold is not a Hollywood movie which moves in a linear fashion to some happy utopian ending. And the history of revolutions, recent and distant history, tells us that most, if not all, revolutions are followed by setbacks and are hijacked by counter-revolutionary forces, but they do sow the seeds for a democratic future that is relatively more just than the regimes that it destabilized. And I think we should keep that in mind. The other important issue, I think, and some might think that it's a luxury to spend too much time thinking about terminology, but I think that's quite important actually, because what is happening or has been happening is the hijacking not only of these revolts politically, but the hijacking of their meaning and their memory. And we know how that happens and how that is deployed by, especially in the Arab world, of course, by the mainstream media, which is by and large owned by regimes or entities representing the regimes that intervened right away to make sure that these revolutions or revolts are dispersed, that they lose their energy, that they're militarized, that they're turned into civil wars and so on and so forth. And I also want us, in a way, not to take these revolts for granted, in a way. And I think here we come to the generational aspect. I want us to remember in the years, or at least the decade preceding these uprisings, the utter despair and the near consensus of so-called experts and observers and everyone else, almost everyone else, telling us that such events were impossible. I am old enough, sadly, to remember and know how many people made careers by parroting this same mantra. And I can't go into it, but that, of course, you know it, that the Arab Islamic world or the Middle East, of course, is exceptional, and that such revolts or a movement towards democratic change is impossible for structural and for historical reasons. Variations on the Orientalist paradigm, of course. So, I must say, it was enjoyable to see these people scrambling and being really confused in the first few weeks to explain, or rather explain away, how come these revolts, these massive, amazing mass movements took place in these very same societies that we were told time and again were not dynamic enough, were stagnant, were this, were that. Many people also made careers talking and writing about the death of the Arab street, and then we realized that the Arab street is alive and well. I mention that because now we have the same despair setting again, and sadly, large chunks of people, understandably so, are moving back into that mentality. And I just want to remind us how, in the efforts to explain away why these events took place, there was the silly argument about social media. Don't get me wrong, of course, social media is very important, but that was conflating and confusing the tool with the event itself. Revolutions and mass movements always use whatever is available, whether it's sticks or pamphlets or paper or the printing press, and then social media. But it was a sign of the same old problems when many rushed to say, well, it was, and of course, sadly, this was internalized by a lot of Arabs and others, that it was Twitter or it was Facebook, and often people were thanking Mark Zuckerberg as if he had something to do. And then we had the figures that were pushed up front as the representatives of the revolutions, like the Egyptian Google executive, who wasn't even in Egypt. Not that initiatives on social media that had to do with police violence and repression and things like that were not tributaries that, of course, all poured into that great river that's called the revolution. But what this does, this type of argument, intentionally or not, is that it erases, first of all, a very long established history of political opposition and revolution in the region, with many revolutions. And you can also see that in how right away, as soon as these revolts took place, there were already signs and metaphors and songs from previous revolts and previous movements. The other thing is how it erases, of course, the indigenous, the human infrastructure of the men and the women who made the revolution. The other thing about the terminology is to call it spring, again, not to haggle too much about terminology, but that also works to erase the local history and to somehow portray these events as if they're some kind of belated catching up with European history. And the terminology is very problematic because these are revolts that stem from a completely different context and for a completely different reason. Of course, there were others who told us that it was Obama's speech in Cairo that inspired everyone. And the more sinister ones are that somehow the Bush's invasion, for those who looked at it positively, was what started the domino effect. And what that does, of course, as I said, is that it erases the real agents of these revolutions. And as if liberationist tendencies can only emanate from a place in Europe and cannot be local. So, I guess the one thing that we need to keep in mind in looking at these revolts and revolutions. And of course, as I said, the tendency now is to look at them as failed revolutions. I don't think that is productive, because as I said, revolutions, we should think of them as one wave in a long process that is still active in a way. And we can see that in the occasional outbursts, whether in Sudan or in Tunisia or in Iraq, that something has changed. And here I want to inject something more personal, in that for those of my generation, in a way, we grew up, our world and our visual landscape was all of authoritarian regimes that seemed to be impossible to overthrow. And for example, the entire time I was in Iraq, of course, mass demonstrations were only linked in my mind to saying yes to the leader and yes to the leader. And of course, the revolts changed all of that. So for the younger generation who grew up now with these revolts, demonstrating and organizing and being active is something that is natural in a way. So their collective memory is, I think, more open to the potential and to the horizon of revolutionary change. And initially, when we were hearing a lot of happy stories about what was taking place, I'm sure some of you remember how there were, in a certain high school in Jordan, the students staged a revolt against. So there were all these signs of that real deep radical change that goes into every aspect of society and of interrelationships, and not just changing the head of the regime as happened in Egypt and Tunisia. The other thing which I take from Asif Bayat is that, in a way, if revolutions are always about movement and change, obviously what we've had is that we've had these mass movements that were really amazing, but we have not had the actual radical change. But that, again, should not be attributed to any cultural reasons, even though I am a scholar and a maker of culture, but should be looked at historically and to always focus on socioeconomic reasons. And so the radical structural change did not take place, and that is why, whether it's the deep state or whatever terminology we use, other forces were able either to hijack and to appropriate and to become free riders. Of course, it's for a variety of reasons also. Some write and say we had revolutions without revolutionaries. Not meaning there weren't people who carried out these revolutions, but there wasn't an organized structure or a political party that could, translate the revolutionary demands into political action. Whereas these other forces on the ground that already had their infrastructure and their organizational ability, like the Muslim Brotherhood or others elsewhere, who were able then to step in and take over. And also, of course, there are many factors depending on the context. The naivete with which a lot of people looked at the army in Egypt, of course, and the state, and not realizing that that first act was actually a coup in and of itself. When the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces fooled us all with one of the generals saluting the martyrs, but that was actually a coup to, sacrifice Mubarak and a few others, but to keep the regime intact. We don't have time to go into why is it that there weren't, revolutionary structures or revolutionary organizations in place. Oh my God, I didn't think I would have enough to say, and now I only have 5 minutes left. One thing that I want to say is, and this is not only on the popular level, but I read that from a lot of intellectuals in the way to go back to my earlier theme about how these Arab revolts are being narrated now, and the danger of course, as the case is always, of the victors writing the history. In that now people are somehow, I mentioned this example because one of the famous Syrian intellectuals, for example, wrote an article about a month ago saying, "Laytaha lam takun," where that the revolution never took place, because all of the events that have taken place because of the counter-revolution and because of foreign interference and militarization and these revolts turning into civil wars, all of that is somehow attributed to the revolts themselves and to the revolution instead of being attributed to the counter-revolution. Needless to say, the fact that these revolts took place in a very highly important geostrategic region in the world, and the fear that these revolts would spill over and reach a place like Saudi Arabia, all these other oil kingdoms, and it did, meant, and we all know how important this region is to the reigning economic system in the world. So the priority was that at any cost, that these revolutionary waves do not reach these places. So then we have to understand all of that and understand, as I said before, the counter-revolutionary forces. Now, this is not meant to not recognize or underestimate the limitations and the problems and the mistakes that were committed, but we should focus equally on the counter-revolution, because what is being disseminated now is somehow that, basically, to put it in a nutshell, that, you know, revolution is a very bad thing because it leads to civil war and the destruction of country. And needless to say, the satellite channels that are spewing this are the satellite channels that are owned by the most anti-democratic regimes, monarchies. And of course, I know they try to support this faction or that faction, but always in a way to rob the energy of these revolutionary movements. So the conditions, the demographic and the socioeconomic conditions that produced these revolts are all there, and actually they are becoming more acute. So I think it's important to recognize that this was one wave and there will be other waves, because ultimately the disproportionate number of young men and women in this region who face a very challenging socioeconomic situation are not going to just take it. And this is also, you know, it's part of a global movement. And I will end with saying one thing, that, of course, you know how Occupy Wall Street, with all of its problems and its unfortunate trajectory and end, was inspired in a way by the Arab revolts, and that in one of the signs that were carried in the Women's March against Trump had the slogan "Al-Sha'b yurid isqat al-nizam," which it might be, you know, the people want to topple the regime. It says something very important about how these revolts are part of our collective memory and part of a global movement. And I don't think that despair anyway is productive, and we should not succumb to it. And I think with that but that's only 20 minutes, not 30 minutes. But anyway, I think I've said enough. We can talk more about that in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sinan, and for this very interesting and provocative presentation. We will move to Max now, and Max Rodenbeck has been the director of the Economist of MENA office over the last 6 years, and he has covered not only Egypt and Tunisia, but as well Libya, Syria, Yemen, and it would be interesting to see how from different places people are telling the story differently. The floor is yours, Max.
Thanks, Dina. Is this on? Yeah, it's on? That's great. Thank you very much, Dina. That was super. And I'd like to thank the Asfari Institute for making this happen. It's wonderful to be in Beirut. I haven't been back for several years. I've now fled the Middle East. I'm a first-class refugee. Frankly, it just got too sad, having been through all of these revolutions. And I'm sure many of you can understand that. I'm going to bore you tonight with a lot of lists and dates and numbers. And I'll just start by listing, just for the purpose of sort of re-emphasizing what an amazing year the Year of Revolutions was. January 14th, 2011, Tunisia. January 25th, Egypt. January 27th, the first very big demonstration in Sana'a in Yemen. February 14th, Bahrain. February 17th, Libya. This is all in the space of basically 1 month, all these uprisings. March 25th, that's the first large demonstrations in Damascus, although it's difficult to give a real pinpoint to the start of the Syrian uprising. And I'll just add on to that, because it's in the same year, and people forget this. July 9th, that's the year of independence for South Sudan. And now I'm going to challenge you a little bit and give you some other dates and see who knows what these dates are. If any of you would like to volunteer a guess. Does anyone remember the 1st of March, 1991?
Raise your voice.
Very good. The Iraqi uprising, the Shia uprising in the south of Iraq, precisely. January 11th, 1992. This is the date that the Algerian regime canceled the results of elections, which sparked off a 10-year civil war in Algeria. The 9th of December, 1987, first Palestinian Intifada. February 14th, that must be a date that strikes some memories, distant ones, faded ones. February 14th, 2005, Lebanon's independence revolution, as it was called then. I'll throw in some other ones. This is a non-Arab country, but I was there, so I'll have to throw it in. 15th of June, 2009, the Green Revolution in Iran. March 5th, 1991, the other end of Iraq, Kurdistan. And one could add many more, actually. 28th September 2000, second Palestinian Intifada. Go back a bit further. We might include February 2nd, 1982. Does that ring a bell? Hama. 1982, there was another uprising in southern Turkey. How about April 13th, 1975? That's a big one. People remember that? Beginning of the Lebanese Civil War. Now, these may be events that all seem to have not so much to do with each other. I mean, I've made a list of things that includes all sorts of stuff, from the 2011 uprisings to localized uprisings to civil wars that went on for a very long time. But I think they have quite a lot in common. And I think one thing they have in common is I was just reading a book, an interesting book recently. It's a history of civil wars in general by a very great historian, David Armitage. And he makes a little point that I think is interesting, which is that virtually every revolution is in some ways a subset of a civil war. And I think it's an interesting point. It's worth debating. I'm not sure if I'm totally convinced. But I think to put revolutions in the context of civil war is kind of an interesting thing, because needless to say, when we look at what happened in 2011, many of those uprisings, revolutions, whatever you call them, devolved into civil wars of one kind or another. And of course, the other thing that those dates that I mentioned have in common, uprisings of one kind or another, and the thing that really stands out, the most salient thing, is that nearly all of them failed. So I think when we look at the revolutions of 2011 in context, they're surprising because they all happened at the same time, but they're not surprising in that most of them failed, at least in the regional context. And as Sinan pointed out, that's true in global context as well. It's sort of like startup businesses; most of them fail. There are, two successes from from this long list that I reeled off there. Two possible successes you might count. One is Iraqi Kurdistan, which is, they got their autonomy. They're on their way towards something close to independence, perhaps, with a big boost from outside powers, needless to say. And it's not a done deal. And the other one is Tunisia, but that's also not particularly resolved. Many people in Tunisia would say that it's the ancien regime has come back with different faces, and it's still not very stable. And I suppose if you want to be very, very perverse, you might say that the efforts to topple Saddam Hussein also succeeded. But that would really annoy Sinan. Of course, it's an outside agent who did that. And I'm just doing that to annoy Sinan, basically. I don't really believe that, but I just thought I'd throw that in to be provocative. And I think we also don't know, Libya might still surprise us. It's still a work in rather cumbersome progress. But basically all of the rest of these about 20 different events that I listed, they're all failures. And they failed for many of the same reasons. The states that they challenged were too strong, or too ruthless, or too cunning, or they were held up by outside powers that were too strong. But also in most of the cases that I've mentioned, there was dissent on the front of the uprising. I mean, among the people rising up. In most of these cases, the movements themselves lacked enough cohesion. They lacked a strategic vision beyond the immediate goal of, say, toppling a leader. Hosni Mubarak, the Egyptian revolution is a very good example of this. Everyone could agree on getting rid of Mubarak, but beyond that, there was absolutely no agreement. And all too often, once the immediate goal was achieved, the whole coalition fell apart. And fell apart as one faction tried to dominate the rest, or in effect to capture the state. And we've just seen this again and again in all kinds of different contexts. I mean, for example, Lebanon in 2005, the great intifada of 2005 did lead to some success. Syria withdrew its army, there was a change of government, et cetera, but the new government that came in sort of, you might say, attempted to capture the state in a way that caused things to tip out of balance, and it wasn't successful either. And not to mention Syria, which is, the opposition was unable to hold together at all, and until now, and it's quite disastrous, as we all know. So, I mean, when we talk about 2011, another friend has just written a book which he's titled False Dawn, the False Dawn of Arab Revolutions. But I think given this litany of other failures that we might just as easily call this a false sunset, actually, or perhaps just call it another false sunset, the whole 2011 experience. Many of these regimes were not gotten rid of. But that is not to say that 2011 has not changed things. I mean, the revolutions themselves changed things, but at the same time, we're looking at a region that is radically different for many reasons. The revolutions themselves being just one factor in many. And I just wanted to talk a bit about what is different about today's Middle East. And I mean, to sort of show what's different, I'll give you another list of things. A list of the old paradigms that we lived with in the Arab world for 30 years, decades, maybe perhaps longer. What you'd call the old paradigms, the old sawabit, the things that are solid and not changing. One of them is that oil is a crucial commodity, and that those who have oil are lucky and very rich. Another is that, and I'm talking about these are paradigms from the Arab perspective, that Israel is a fragile polity that's kept basically alive by an American lifeline, and that those two factors, oil and Israel, were going to keep America, the superpower, deeply engaged in the Middle East forever. The idea that Palestine is an enduring and central issue for all Arabs, that is a matter of time before Arabs become strong enough to challenge Israel, that there's such a thing as an Arab system, with annual summit meetings, ministers of interior cooperating, et cetera, and with the idea of converging towards Arab unity, that Iran is an isolated country, isolated and inward-looking and paranoid, that Russia is completely out of the picture, that Egypt is the key country and a linchpin of Arab security. These are all ideas that were considered, fixed ideas. And of course, I mean, this has all been blown up, and not necessarily due to the uprisings at all. We have an American withdrawal from the region which is going to potentially accelerate under Donald Trump, although he's a very unpredictable creature. Who knows, he might send the American Navy back into Beirut harbor. I have no idea. But it seems likely that the trajectory is more towards backing off and withdrawing, something that started under Obama and is likely to continue. And an ironic thing about it's ironic that this coincides with the complete collapse of the sort of Arab project, the Arab national project, Arab unity, et cetera, that it's hard to even speak of that anymore. Israel, Iran, and Turkey are now the dominant regional powers. Russia poses as the responsible outside power. Oil is no longer nearly as important, and it's on its way out. It'll take quite a long time, mind you, but it's on its way out. And that there are the two successful big projects that seem to have, the only two big projects that were successful in the Middle East so far are one, the Iranian Revolution, and defending the Iranian Revolution and Iran's project to get America out of the Middle East. That's a success. And the extension of Iranian power well outside the territory of Iran. And the second is the Zionist project. Israel is very strong. It's never looked stronger. So those are the kind of new realities. But that was almost a digression into sort of geopolitics. But if we go back to the actual impact of the revolutions, I mean, I agree very much with Sinan that despite their evident sort of failure, there were important things that happened which have changed the nature of the region. Many masks have been removed. There's been a process of self-discovery that is extremely important that can't be missed. And I've made another list here. Again, I'm sorry about my lists. One thing that was I think recognized during these revolutions is the importance of class. This is something that had been kind of pushed under the carpet in a lot of Arab countries. Which are very sort of governed by state-engineered socialism in general. This is the general picture. But actually, the importance of class was actually crucial for example, the uprising in Syria. In many ways, I think this has been a class war. It's taken on sectarian tones, but the class element cannot be dismissed. Tunisia is very much the same. Sectarian identity has been reinforced in ways that were thought to have been old. The cracks that were there turned out to be much wider than people thought they were. The failure of elites to raise up their masses, so to speak, and create citizens has been exposed. The fact that the Arab world doesn't really particularly care about Palestine very much has been exposed. The fact that regimes are willing to use extreme violence was exposed. A lot of the violence that was there was latent. We all know it was there. And sometimes it could be seen. Some countries were obviously violent, like Saddam Hussein's Iraq. In Syria, the violence was a bit more disguised. But when it appeared, it was extreme. And a country like Egypt, for example, most people didn't experience the violence of the state. But there's no question now that the state is prepared to use extreme violence. So I think now we have, as a result of these factors, we have a collapse of trust, general society, trust among different members of society, which is new. There's a lowered threshold of violence. There's been a tremendous challenge to all the prevailing ideologies, among them the Arab nationalist ideology, but also Islamism, state socialism. There's a turn towards more self-reliance, towards more individualism. There's an understanding of the importance of grassroots organization, which may not have been there in the same way. And I'll move on now to what we can sort of project. What's the prognosis after these things? And I'm going to say very few things, and they're all rather sad. I mean, I think one is that the Middle East is going to remain very weak, and I'm talking geopolitics again. It'll remain weak and prey to outside meddling for some time to come. And the Middle East weakness is one reason for its sort of political weakness is one reason for this kind of the being prone to revolutions and upsets. Another thing we can look forward to is Iran consolidating its arc of control that basically extends to where we're sitting. I wouldn't be surprised if another thing that happens is that we see actual forms of, it'll be called something else, I'm sure, ethnic cleansing in Israel. That's all very grim, and I'm sad to sound such a grim note. But I wanted to end with something else. I mean, are we looking for a model Arab state for the future? What is the bellwether state? We talked about a country like Tunisia, which seems to have survived its uprising and so on, has reached a certain equilibrium. In the whole Arab, 22 Arab states, Morocco is another place that's doing okay. But I would ironically suggest that perhaps the model Arab state, that not because it's a good model, but because it's not such an unlikely model for other parts of the region, is actually Lebanon, which may seem ridiculous to a lot of Lebanese. But I can remember joking 10 years ago after Syria withdrew its troops from Lebanon with a Syrian friend that maybe it was time for Lebanon to invade Syria and take over, colonize Syria. It was time for, and actually even now I think that wouldn't have been such a bad idea. Not so much because Lebanese confessionalism is a wonderful thing or anything like that, but if you sort of strip it down to its smaller parts, you have a fairly weak central state with a fair amount of local autonomy, not much pretense of being a great unity, a division of powers that is made, even if it's not a very equal one or very, and a sort of general understanding that it's all too fragile to rock the boat, and that you better just get on with it. Across the region, there's a need to find different kinds of government. It's very obvious, different from what we have now. Whatever you call it, kinds of autonomy, kinds of federalism. And I think it's interesting, actually, a news item I just came across this morning in this regard, that the first outlines of the Russian project for a new Syrian constitution were leaked out. And I thought it was just kind of interesting. What are these some of the points that Russia is hoping to, impose as the new great arbiter of Syria's future? One is that the president of Syria need not be Muslim. The president would serve for a single 7-year term. That there would be equal language rights for Kurds and other minorities. The parliament would appoint the head of the court. Sharia would not be the sole source of law. There would be an assembly of regions as well as a people's assembly. That list I think is interesting because actually a lot of those things are actually already in the Lebanese constitution, which is kind of interesting. Anyway, I'll stop there. I just meant to be provocative. I hope you don't take offense at anything that I've said. But I'm hoping to provoke some interesting questions, and I'm very happy to look forward to debating.
Thank you both. You can applaud. I think now you understand why we chose our two speakers. One is very post-colonial reading of what has happened, and one is a very post-nationalist reading of what has happened. And I think these are the fresh readings that are on the place. And beside, the Arab awakening, linking the Arab uprising to Nahda, or other ready-made soups, I think Sinan and Max have the advantage of being bold and going until the end in their both readings of what has happened and what can be the future in the coming few years. Sinan has asked to give some comments. I don't know on. He promised it won't be on Max's presentation, but in general, and then we will open the floor. Okay?
No, thank you. I didn't promise, actually.
So you don't have the right to.
No, but I want to just say a few things that are important because all revolutions fail. That's the thing. So it is not shocking that the French Revolution failed and took 100 years to stabilize. The Iranian Revolution failed. So we should just keep that in mind. And I don't think Morocco is a success story. I mean, we heard the story about this. The merchant who was drowned in the trash car. So Morocco is not having a civil war and not being in total chaos is not a good thing. It's a brutal regime, but for some reason, Morocco is the darling of Western media, as is Kurdistan. So I want to say that oftentimes we read this, or we used to read this, look at Iraqi Kurdistan and why it succeeded, why the rest of the country collapsed. And of course, there are the undertones that you know why they collapsed. The reason is not to be sought in the fact that these are Kurds or Arabs, but in material history. That in 1991, the Kurds, when they got their semi-autonomy, that in 2003, the US invasion did not invade Kurdistan, and they were in charge and took hold of all of the institutions, whereas in the rest of Iraq, the entire state was taken apart and dismantled. In Kurdistan, it wasn't. And Kurdistan now, the government is one of the most corrupt governments in the world. I mean, if you think it is democratic, that the president and the prime minister and the head of the istikhbarat are all from the same family. I mean, and we didn't talk about in Kurdistan itself, there was a massive movement because the situation there is really horrible, it's very corrupt, so I don't think it's a success story. The other thing is, I mean, we should talk about neoliberalism, of course. Neoliberalism and the dominance of the neoliberalism created many of these problems. And ironically, the speed with which these revolutions succeeded initially was the disadvantage. Because in 18 days, you don't have time to consolidate a movement and choose leaders. You know, other revolutions take years, in which time the opposition has time to consolidate, to create networks, and so on and so forth. The other thing is about Palestine. I mean, we know that the Palestinian issue has been exploited by all these regimes cynically, but actually many of the people, the main activists in Egypt who carried out the revolution always invoked Palestine, and that the second Palestinian Intifada was an inspiration for them. And they had signs. And one of the first acts in Tunisia was, and Tunisia remains the most pro-Palestinian country. So irrespective of what these regimes do, actually Palestine, aside from ideology, is the initial central question. Just look at the refugees who are still rotting in the camps in this country, and all the tension, and the people who were displaced from Syria, who were initially displaced in 1948. These people should not be forgotten. So whether, I mean, the success of the Zionist project or of a state like Morocco, I don't consider it success. It is actually, this is what's going to produce the exact opposite. And yeah, the last thing is the terminology. I go back. I was in Iraq in 1991. Sorry, I'm going to pull one of those anecdotal things that I tell my students not to do. But the uprising in Iraq was neither Shiite nor Kurd. I lived in Baghdad and I saw graffiti on the wall, and Saddam Hussein's hometown, Tikrit, had people going out and demonstrating. And the regime lost control of all of Iraq for 3 days. All of the istikhbarat cars were withdrawn, and there was no state for 3 days. But then the signing of the ceasefire allowed Saddam Hussein to use the helicopters, and of course Bush, they changed the tune and said, well, this is an internal matter. So Saddam understood the signals. So why do we reinforce the same tired categories that got us nowhere of Shi'is and Sunnis? You can't have class and also have Shi'is and Sunnis. You gotta kind of decide on that. Wassalamu alaikum.
Thank you to both speakers. The floor is open. I just want to remind you that you can ask the questions in English, Arabic, or French, and we will make the... هنترجم. And the floor is open. I prefer to have 2-3 rounds, so... and please mention your name when you start. 1, wait a second. Any other persons who would like to follow? 2. Wow. Very good. And me 3. Okay? Go ahead, sir.
Hashim Al-Sayran. Thank you for both speakers. Mr. Rodenbeck, my question is for you. I just have 2 points, I think, not really questions. The first one, you said about the studies of revolutions and civil wars. I invite you to explore a whole academic field called contentious politics that is based on that. The fact that civil wars, revolutions, uprisings should all be studied under one big umbrella rather than being studied separately. The second point is you spoke a lot about success and failure, as though there's any clear criteria for what constitutes a successful or failed revolution. More importantly, this talk of success and failure overlooks the fact that it's only been 6 years since the uprising. Revolutions are long processes, you have long trajectories, and you have a lot of slow-moving things that are happening in counter-hegemonic processes, especially in the way we think, the way we imagine, and the way we remember. Let's say in a hypothetical world, in 20 years, you wake up to a more democratic Middle East. people will remember 2011 as a very successful time when everything started. So I think it's very limiting to have this success and failure talk at this very early stage. Thank you.
Yes, sir, in the purple.
Hi, my name is Amir. My first question is for Mr. Sinan. You said at the end that you can't have Sunni and Shia and class at the same time. But I don't know, I disagree, so, but I'm not going to say why I disagree. I would just like if you could clarify why you think that is. And Mr. Max, I wanted to ask you, you say that the Lebanese model could be used across the Arab world, but you also have like different demographics in different countries. Like Iraq is mostly Shia, so it's very different. And it's been implemented a system that's kind of similar to Lebanon's in Iraq and Yemen, and it hasn't been very successful. Also, I think that the relative stability in Lebanon is because the disenfranchised group, which I'm going to call Sunnis, okay, although maybe they don't exist, isn't revolting or protesting aggressively because they saw what happened in Syria and they're frightened that the same thing would happen in Lebanon, while in Syria in March they had just seen NATO intervene in Libya, and they're probably optimistic that they could overthrow the regime very quickly.
Yeah, briefly, sorry, because he asked me the question. Oh, sorry.
You are so anarchist for my taste.
I thought you said I was post-colonial, now I'm anarchist.
You can be both. Okay, Ali Ragel and then Thanasis and then me. تفضل. يعني بس عشان يبقى في شوية قواعد.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the speakers. Definitely all revolutions fail. This is a very favorite quote, a Deleuzian quote. But I think we also should speak about defeated revolutions, failed revolution, successful revolutions. And what was we witnessing in Egypt is, a process of a continuous clashes, struggles, contentious politics, if you like to put it, but we can't speak about a defeated one. I think it's too early to speak about a failed one as well. But regarding civil war as part of the process, I have the feeling that what you were trying to articulate is a bit too abstract for what is taking place. Like, we can't speak about civil wars as if they are all the same. Like, definitely the Russian Revolution witnessed a civil war which was completely in a different direction and not like what we are witnessing in Syria. Second, I would love if we can speak about class and not sectarian issues, and I would like if we can separate them from each other, but I don't think that we can do this easily, and I think they can go hand in hand. Yes, we can speak about class and we can speak about sectarian issues. It's a matter of construction of the subject, which is very ideological, very materialistic. So when we speak about sectarian issues, we are not reproducing these tired categories. Unfortunately, I would really love as a Marxist or partially a Marxist to speak about only the class, which is definitely not the case.
Thanasis?
Just a quick question.
You wait for the mic to get it taped.
Hey, hi, I'm Thanasi Kambanis. I was interested in whether either of you had a take on what, if any, emerging revolutionary ideas have matured in the year since 2011, because we were very familiar with what these uprisings were against. You both spoke in different ways about the fragmentation or lack of focus or directionlessness in that spasmodic reaction. So I'd love to hear, and maybe some answer other than nothing. Maybe your answer will be nothing, but I'd love to hear if there's something you see, germs or seeds or threads emerging.
I will not ask you a question.
Yes, I agree with you. In a way, I was not saying that we should not take sect as a category, but I am speaking from the bitterness with how often, whether in Iraq or elsewhere, there was never any discussion of class, and everything was about sectarianism. Also, in a very problematic transhistorical way, yes, sect did become very important, but there was a process that's only almost 20 years old and not hundreds of years of old, definitely. So I agree with you. In a way, it should be intersectional in a way, because now, sadly, we cannot discuss class only without discussing sect, whether in this country or whether in Iraq. So I didn't mean to say that we should abandon it. The other thing is about, I mean, most of the people who participated in these revolts are either in exile, whether you speak about Syria, either they're dead or in prison or in exile in Turkey. They're scattered all over the world. The same goes in a way for Egypt. A lot of them are in prison, some of them are in Brooklyn or elsewhere. So, but I think now people are trying, especially with the anniversary, are taking stock, you know. So there is a new leftist journal that was established in Egypt that has Hani Shukrallah and others that is devoted to rethinking and reformulating all of these ideas. But again, I agree with the gentleman that 6 years, you know, we would say it jokingly that, you know, sana fi hayat al-shu'ub is nothing, 1 year in the, but 6 years is a very short period of time if we look at all other revolutions. And now people are taking stock and trying to reformulate and to learn from their mistakes for the future.
Go ahead, Max.
Yeah, lots of questions out there, and I'm going to just address them in no particular order, and probably not very satisfactorily, I'm afraid. I think it was Hashim. It's Hashim, right? Yeah. Yeah. The contentious politics as an entire way of looking. I think it's a very good idea. Yes, good, great. Yeah. It's a very good way to look at revolution, civil wars, all as one package. And this idea of picking them apart and looking at one thing it makes little sense. I think that's good. So that's my answer. Yes. And then your question about the sort of metric of success and failure, and I do apologize for using that metric too much because it is extremely inexact and is rather subjective, and perhaps not even very useful. That's true, and you know, I mean, when we talk about the length of time things have taken, of course, the most famous quote on that is Zhou Enlai, the great Chinese leader, who was asked about the French, what he thought about the French Revolution, and he said, and this is in the 1950s, 60s even, 60s, I think, he said, it's too early to tell. So I think that is not an unreasonable thing to say about these revolutions that happened. But part of the reason that I want to try and put things in a longer term context also was to say that we maybe shouldn't even be asking, should these, you know, were these revolutions of 2011 succeeded or not? You know, maybe that isn't the question to ask anyway. I mean, it's just more interesting that in that particular year there was a concentration of reasons that made it blow up in so many different places all at once. And I think, let's see, what other questions we have? Yeah, and you may have noticed that my remarks about the Lebanese model were slightly tongue-in-cheek. I mean, I don't mean that anyone should like take the Lebanese constitution and apply it in Saudi Arabia, for example, or that it's a particularly wonderful constitution. It's just that there's some parts of that formula that deserve some scrutiny because this crazy little country has managed to hold together in ways that a lot of people would never have expected. And there's something to be said for that. It's very imperfect, needless to say. But it's just interesting. I just thought it was kind of amusing that Russia's great model for Syria actually includes some of these elements that haven't actually been tried in other countries in the region. I thought your remark about the Sunnis in Lebanon was interesting. I think, and this is completely off the discussion that we're having about other things, but I think one reason you haven't seen a Sunni response is because the Sunnis in Lebanon are terribly divided by class, among other things. And that's always been a problem. Class and region and so on and so forth. They just don't cohere. They never have cohered very well. What other things? Yeah. This idea that absolutely it's, I would say, actually silly to try to separate sectarian questions from class questions and so on. This is part of the trouble with sort of classic Marxism is this it's got an excessively dry approach. You have to factor in sentiment in ways that we're not taken account of, and that's always true. And as for Tanasi's question about revolutionary ideas, I think you supplied the sad answer yourself. But then I would say that if we're saying it's 6 years is not enough for success or failure to be judged, perhaps 6 years isn't enough for revolutionary ideas to gel as well. These are most of the uprisings that took place in 2011 didn't have a deep intellectual underpinning to begin with. You know, there wasn't something there that intellectually speaking provoked these uprisings in most cases. So the intellectual output is going to be in response to what happened, you know, and that isn't even over yet. So it may be too soon to judge about the actual intellectual output. And as Sinan was saying, this is something that's in progress, and it's happening now. And I think, yes, absolutely, the longer time frame. I mean, you know, the thing that looked most similar, I mean, back in 2011 when all this was going on, the sort of historical moment, there were several historical moments that this looked very similar to. One was obviously the uprisings in Europe in 1848. And as we know, there were, you know, something like 24 uprisings all across Europe, all in the same year. All of them but one crushed. But 12 years later, 1860, you get Italian independence, et cetera, I mean, begins to be a chain of things that happen. So at that time, there was a 12-year lag, I suppose. I mean, it's impossible to say how long the lag will be in the Middle East, you know, but one can assume it will be quite long. And I mean, also in the modern world, the capacity of states to remain repressive is quite a lot bigger than it was in the 19th century. And I mean, it's quite disturbing that, for example, if we look elsewhere in the world, you know, we are how many years after the Tiananmen massacre? And China is moving towards being increasingly restrictive and less democratic rather than the other way around. We are almost 30 years, aren't we? It's coming up, I mean, at least 25 years after Tiananmen Square in Beijing. You know, in some ways, you know, Putin's Russia doesn't show any signs of changing. You know, these may be the models that will prevail in the Middle East for quite some time.
Thank you, Max. We will start a second round of questions. So there is Sir, and there is me, and there is Sir, 2, 3. I think I just want to acknowledge, to say that I didn't hear things that I was expecting you to focus on, like the word youth, like the word individuals and individuality and individuation. I was expecting you to talk even very quickly about the newcomers into politics who are not ready to fit under set in stone types of organization. And we saw that in Egypt, in Tunisia, in many other places. You didn't talk about what I call the remobilization of old repertoire, like Palestine, like Islam. A lot of remobilization of what Charles Tilly called repertoire of action to get people on the street mobilized have been used. Does it mean it's central? I think what was central was that demographically speaking, concretely speaking, we are 60% of the Arab world under 40 years old, and these people have never lived neither 1967 as like me, nor the 1973, and were in mid-school in 2005, and even were 10 years old when the war on Iraq has started. So with this kind of what they call episteme, these newcomers have been using a lot of repertoires of action for their mobilization, but we don't want to put them into our own lens of people over 45 who are thinking in terms of Arab nationalism, broken ideology that cannot fit any longer, or as a Western maneuver to pervert our burgeoning call for democratization. So I would like to hear from both speakers where this youth, individualization, and individual voice fit in both readings that you have kindly accepted to offer us today.
Yeah.
Sir, and then I don't remember.
My name is Nabil Kronfol. I'm obviously not from this group. I'm a physician. I have a very candid question. You didn't speak about the image of Islam that came up through all these revolts. I mean, I don't think many would. I think many would agree that I wouldn't have expected anything close to what the various acts and crimes, etc. How much was this used for or against the revolution? And the question that comes with it: had this not occurred, these excesses, these crimes, etc., would the outcome have been different? Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I don't know if it's a lady.
Who's next?
The blue shirt, the blue sweater.
Yeah, my name is Jack. My question is very simple. What are the lessons learned from all these revolutions? Do we have any lessons that we can conclude and say, you know, things went wrong because of 1, 2, 3, 4, and because definitely there is nothing that went right, in my opinion. So what went wrong so that our revolutions did not basically achieve, whether it is in short term or long term? Short term, we are living in a fast economy, we are living in a fast age, and 6 years is a lot, I think. You know, things are developing very fast. So yes, we should be able to achieve in, you know, quicker than 100 years, you know, from now, our, you know, dreams or our ideas that we want to kind of pass to our children or the next generation. Thank you.
So any other question for this round, or should we go back to the speakers? Okay. Sinan, please.
Thank you. I want to say that I think if we remember, the problem is we don't have also a history of course, because the states would not allow it. You know, someone like Khalid Fahmy and others were trying to construct an archive. We don't have a history of these revolts. But I must say that the fascinating thing was how the generational gap was bridged during these revolts. Yes, there were young men and women who were not alive, but Sheikh Imam and Ahmed Fuad Nagim became part of their repertoire. And this is the fascinating thing about these revolutionary moments, is that how we recreate the meaning of a people. And I think what was more important is the notion of a shab, of course, which is a transitory. But for a few weeks, there was something called a shab, and that shab was doing something. And that's one of the important lessons, more so than the individual, because I think the problem of the previous era, in a way, of neoliberalism, we know what mostly where the focus on the individual and narcissism, where that leads us, whereas this was the temporary recognition that this was the collective fate of a people. But I was heartened by how people were, yes, it was also, I mean, that's the amazing thing about revolutions, is that there are moments of education when people not only discovered their own revolutionary repertoire that goes back 100 years, but they also discovered the earlier generations, and you could see it how people welcomed someone when they went to the Midan, someone who had spent 20 or 30 years in prison, that they realized that that person, even though they had not communicated, they were not part of the same movement, but was part of the same tradition. Of course, these moments don't last in a way, but there were conversations, and I would say that, you know, recognizing that there is something common called Arab cultural political space does not mean that we're trying to revive Arab nationalism in its old style. But I think the fact that spontaneously the slogans of the revolutions were the same, and that how when something happens in Tunisia, because of this collective space that is shared by language and by culture and by also consuming the same media, actually something that happens in Egypt ends up So there is this common Arab space, of course. Importantly, it should not become exclusionary. It should learn from all of the mistakes of the xenophobia, of the anti-Kurdishness and anti-Armenian, what have you. But, you know, the fate of this region is collective because it's regional. Why? I'm not saying this about you, but others, whereby in Europe, I'm saying this because a lot of Iraqi intellectuals are not even against a unified Iraq because somehow they think, no, Iraq should be divided. At the same time, or until recently, we're all lauding something like the European Union because it makes sense more to integrate economically and otherwise. But when it comes to the Arab world, we are completely against it, even though we have more reasons to integrate economically and otherwise. Not with the Gulf countries and Saudi Arabia, of course, because they're on a different plane. And that's the other thing that, you know, people are learning from now, is that the brutality of these regional powers that, of course, are willing to destroy Yemen and to go to Bahrain and slaughter to make sure that this does not get there. This is, I know the region is entirely divided between who thinks that Iran is the big Satan and who thinks that Saudi Arabia is the big Satan. Maybe it's good to think that there are two very brutal powers that are carrying out proxy wars on our lands and societies, and that's very important. Briefly, the lessons, I don't know, to go back, for example, to the question, there is a website called Jumhuriya where a lot of Syrian intellectuals and activists are writing their memoirs and are thinking, and it's very important, learning from all of the mistakes and everything. As I said before, the important lesson is that nothing is impossible, that none of this, frankly, crap about how Muslim majority countries cannot have revolution and cannot have democracy and all of that, that this is a dynamic, lively region where if the conditions are there, anything can happen. I just give you one example. 2 years before the revolts, with a journalist, he was telling me, well, after the Iranian uprising, he was saying, look at these people. This is Sha'b Hay. They are alive. We are dead. Nothing happens. Nothing will change. So this proves that despite all of the problems, and as you said, the demographics say it, these millions of people under 40 want to live a more just, equitable life, and they will fight for that. It might be very bloody, it might be very brutal, but they're not just going to stay home and accept their fate. They have the energy, and hopefully they will have the vision.
Thank you, Sinan.
Thanks. Yeah, I just want to say, ironically, I remember hearing exactly the same expression, Sha'b Hay, from Iranians
Yes.
looking at Egypt, in 2011, saying that's where we wish we were like them. We should have fought, fought and beat our regime in 2009, which we didn't do. And I think it's also very important what you're saying about the notion of common Arab space as a much more important concept than Arab unity or some ideological, convergence. But I just wonder if just a question to toss out is this notion of is the common Arab space stronger now, or was it stronger in 2011? Because one of the effects of the revolution, or the immediate effects, was actually a kind of parochialism. Yeah. If you look at the front pages of any newspaper in most of the Arab world these days, it's almost entirely local news with very little interest in the rest of the region. Anyway, but that's just tossing that out. But I think it's an important point. I agree very much with the gentleman who asked the question about Islam. This is something we've been skirting over. It was actually on my list of little points there, but I think I didn't emphasize it enough. Definitely, I think one of the effects of the 2011 and its aftermath is quite a shake-up in political Islam, which is underway, and we don't know what the result is. One would suspect, but it's still too early to say, that the appearance of things like Daesh, the infighting between all the Islamist groups in Syria and in Libya and various other places, it has done great damage, I presume, to the very idea of political Islam. But we don't know what ideological expression this is going to have. one doesn't yet see a great deal, or I don't follow this closely enough perhaps, of sort of self-criticism within sort of Islamist politics beyond just we were right and you were wrong, or but I don't see a new voice emerging that is convincing or intellectually powerful. But it's hard to imagine that all this infighting can go on without really undermining this idea. And the same is true for the sectarian clash. It's hard to see what exactly, what sustains in some ways the revolutionary sort of power elements in Iran is actually sectarianism. It's being in a sea of hostile Sunnis. This is what sustains, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard and so on. But one wonders how long term that can be. So I don't know. But I think it's a very valid question, and it's important. And I wish I had more convincing, deeper answers. But I'm afraid I don't. And the other question about lessons learned from the revolutions. I think, again, this is part of the intellectual output that is, happening now. But I would say that there are some things. It was such a convulsion that I think, one thing. There are some lessons, for example, are that as we were pointing out, as Sinan was pointing out, these revolutions happened too quickly. There was no time for mobilization. And so therefore there is an importance of mobilization that's been underlined, I think. And also there's an importance to engage much more widely in society. You can't just have revolutionaries out on the street that are disengaged. You need elite buy-in and you need a dialogue. I think that's kind of understood. Then I think another thing is the importance of institutions. That it's one thing to overthrow, but it does get rather damaging if you actually pull apart all the institutions, as the Americans did in Iraq, for example, which was most unhelpful. And I think another thing is the importance of incrementalism rather than revolutionary, an explosive moment. But these are ideas that have now, I think people understand, and they understand the need to work within institutions to change the institutions as much as possible from within. Now, of course, there are countries in the region where the nature of politics that makes that extremely difficult. But I think, in a lot of places, the danger of a real collapse of institutions has been seen to be, real and pressing, and there is a need to preserve institutions, but to change them from within. I think another lesson learned is, and I know this particularly from the Egyptian situation, but I think it's true in other countries as well, is that before the Egyptian revolution, Egyptians didn't know quite what their state was. What is this dawla thing? It's just big and mean. But how big, how mean, how does it function? What are its, mafasil, it's kind of, how does it articulate itself, And I think that's all been revealed in ways that were not there before. People have a much stronger understanding of where the nodes of power really lie. So I think
it's a learning curve. I'm sorry to interrupt you. I loved last week Nathan Brown article about we should talk about the white state and not the deep state. Because everyone is going in a total different direction. And I love the idea that we keep changing what we are describing as the Egyptian state types of articulation. Sorry for interrupting you.
And I think, obviously regimes have learned a lot. They've learned how, they have a better idea of how far you can push people before they explode. But they also have, unfortunately, I think they have a shorter fuse too. And I'm afraid that the one lesson that has been learned now is that extreme force is, if you were to be Machiavelli advising your prince, you would tell them to go for extreme force, I suppose, sadly.
So, any other questions?
See, there's a hand over there, comment.
Yes, of course, question or comments. By other people.
Sorry for hogging the mic. It's just an interesting talk. For the repertoires, I think what's most interesting is not the reuse of old repertoires, but in a way the abandoning of old repertoires. I mean, Hamid Dabashi talks about the Arab Spring as a moment, as the end of post-colonialism, because claims were not made in Islamist terms, they were not made in Arab nationalist terms, nor were they made in a response to the West or with the ideals of Western democracy or Western liberalism. So there was a moment of innovation in the Arab Spring where there was an indigenous form of resistance that was burgeoning, that was growing, and that also spread across the world, which is very important, I think, to pay attention to, because it was a moment of innovation. And if we were to consider Charles Tilly, what he says also is that these innovative repertoires, or what he calls transgressive contention, is the most effective form of making claims. And that's it.
If you will use the name dropping, I would say that you are confusing framing and repertoire. And I'm inviting you to read Jasper about framing. And because framing is one cognitive process, but repertoires and reusing repertoires is totally another process. But we can have this discussion, and at the Asfari Institute, we are very much into that. So if you want, we can invite you over lunch with the staff and continue these, because we read this all the time.
Yes, I would accept your invitation.
Ahlan wa sahlan. So on that note, and because I know that the attention span of any person between the age of 20 and 60 is not more than 90 minutes, and we are exactly at 91, we want to end this note that, one, your checklist, it's not over. Two, it's bleak, but maybe it will change. Three, we need a political Arab space, but not maybe with these political states and political regimes in place to start a new Arab common public space, and that all these sad facts don't have to get into us and lead us to suicide, to kill ourselves. Thank you very much for coming and for allowing us to have this moment and to share what was huge 6 years ago in all our lives. Bye. Ça va? Ça va très bien. Reply about framing and contentious and